Dr. Terry Mortenson earned his Ph.D. in the history of geology from Coventry University in England. He has studied and lectured on creation and evolution for more than 25 years. In Origin of Species, Was Darwin Right?, Dr. Mortenson takes a close look at the claims made in Darwin's world-changing book. He answers questions such as, what is natural selection? Can mutations be beneficial? Do animals really change from one kind to another? And most importantly, what is the biblical perspective on these topics?
Origin of Species, Was Darwin Right? Well, I'll give you a guess at what the National Geographic said when they asked a similar question on their cover story article in November of 2004. Was Darwin wrong? They made it clear that he was not wrong, that he was right, and they presented the same arguments that they've been presenting for decades. Nothing new there. But it was only a few months later that Discover magazine joined the chorus and said, testing Darwin, scientists at Michigan State prove evolution works. Now, if you didn't open the magazine to read the article, you would think science has just overwhelmingly confirmed Darwin's theory. But you open the article, and the very first sentence says this: digital organisms, that is, those created in a computer program, not real organisms, just digital ones, that breed thousands of times faster than common bacteria, are beginning to shed light on some of the biggest unanswered questions of evolution. So I guess they didn't prove it. All they did was shed light on some of the biggest questions. Well, the National Academy of Sciences is the highest scientific body in our country, and they published a book in 1998 that was sent out to science teachers around the country, teaching about evolution and the nature of science. And in this book, they said, there is no debate within the scientific community over whether evolution has occurred, and there is no evidence that evolution has not occurred. I want you to notice two things in that statement. First of all, they say there is no debate in the scientific community about evolution. What's the implication of that sentence? It is that if you don't believe in evolution, it's proof positive you're not a scientist. Because all scientists agree about evolution. And then the second thing they say is that there's no evidence that evolution has not occurred. Now, for those of you who remember 8th grade English grammar, you will know that that is a double negative. That's not a very strong statement. They could have said there are mountains of evidence that evolution has occurred. But they make the weaker statement, there's no evidence that it hasn't occurred. But they're very dogmatic here. Well, the theory of evolution can be represented by what I like to call the evolution tree of life. In fact, the evolutionists even talk about this. The evolutionists believe that the first living cell evolved, popped into existence by chance from non-living matter, and then over millions of years of reproduction coupled with natural selection and mutation, which we'll talk about a little later, that single-celled creature diversified into all the different plants and animals that we see on the planet today. So everything is descended from a common ancestor. Now, the evolution theory is based on some assumptions. And we call this philosophy or this assumption, naturalism. And there are two main assumptions in naturalism, and this is the philosophy that controls modern science. The first is that nature or matter is all that exists. And the second is that everything can and must be explained by three things: time and chance and the laws of nature. If you have those three things, time and chance and the laws of nature, the evolutionists say you can explain everything in the living world and indeed everything in the universe. But do all scientists believe in evolution? Consider this statement and think who might have said it. The influence of evolutionary theory on fields far removed from biology is one of the most spectacular examples in history of how a highly speculative idea for which there is no really hard scientific evidence can come to fashion the thinking of a whole society and dominate the outlook of an age. The author goes on, ultimately, the Darwinian theory of evolution is no more nor less than the great cosmogenic, what's that word? Myth of the 20th century. Now, who said that? Well, many people have imagined that it was said by a very articulate but scientifically ignorant Southern Baptist preacher from Alabama. But actually, it wasn't. It was said by Michael Denton, who at the time of writing his book, Evolution: A Theory on Crisis, in 1985, he was an agnostic. He wasn't sure whether there's a God or not. And in the book, he didn't cite one Bible verse to support his conclusion. Rather, he discussed biological, paleontological, and microbiological evidence to lead him to the conclusion that the Darwinian theory of evolution is a myth. But Michael Denton is not the only scientist who has been raising scientific criticisms of evolution. In the last 40 years, there have been a number of books, and they've been coming at a little faster clip. And you'll notice one thing about the dates of all these. They were published before 1998, when the National Academy of Science, as I just quoted, said there was no debate in the scientific community. Furthermore, these are non-scientists who have been raising scientific criticisms against evolution. Many of these authors are lawyers. Lawyers are highly trained to discern when somebody is manipulating the evidence to lead to a faulty conclusion. They're experts in logic. And they, in these writings, accept the scientific observations that the evolutionists say, but argue they don't add up to support the theory. In addition, there has been in the last 40 years the growth of what we call biblical creationists. And many people think that biblical creationists are only in the United States, but actually they're all over the world. The Answers in Genesis ministry began in Australia in 1978. There's a creation science organization in Russia with PhD members. Korea actually has the largest creation organization in the world with over 2,000 members and many of them with PhDs or university teaching positions. In fact, there was an article back in 2000 in the secular weekly science journal New Scientist all about the creation scientists, and they had this map showing that there are over 30 countries of the world that have at least one creation science organization in them. So this is a worldwide movement. Now, just as the evolutionists have some presuppositions from which they build their theory, so do creationists. And those presuppositions come from the Bible. In Genesis chapter 1, we are told that on the third day of creation, God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit, after their kind." And that phrase, "after their kind," appears two more times in relationship to the creation of the plants. And then in verse 21, on day 5, the sea creatures were created after their kind, and the birds after their kind. And then on day 6, the beasts of the earth, the cattle, the creeping things were created after their kind. This phrase, "after their kind," or "after its kind," appears in Genesis 1 10 times. And the repetition is emphatic. God is saying that He made different kinds of creatures to reproduce after their kind, not to change from one kind into a different kind. And then there's one more important passage, and that's in Genesis chapter 6, where God tells Noah to take of every living thing 2 of every kind. And here again we see this phrase, after their kind, repeated 3 times in verse 20. So from these verses, we can make a model for the creation view of the origin of living things. And that is what I like to call the creation forest of life, in contrast to the evolution tree of life. God created the different kinds of plants and animals, distinct. He built into their genetic information potential for variety within the kind, but not the ability to change from one kind into another. And so over the 1,600 years leading up to the flood, they did produce variety within their kind. Then God told Noah to take 2 of every kind of land animal and bird onto the ark. And so he did. He didn't take 2 of every variety, but 2 of every kind. And they came off the ark, and they multiplied. And in the almost 4,000 years since the flood, they've had more time to diversify into more varieties in the post-flood world. So, which of these views of living things is correct? The evolution tree of life or the creation forest of life? Which view is supported by the scientific evidence? Now, in answering this question, we need to keep in mind 2 very important questions. One is, how did the DNA information for the supposed first living microscopic creature come into existence? And then secondly, how did the DNA information in that simple creature get changed and augmented to produce all the different kinds of plants and animals that we see in the fossil record and living on the earth today? So, to begin with, let's look at the question of the origin of the first living cell. Back in 1953, when I was born, this famous experiment was done in Chicago, at the University of Chicago, done by Stanley Miller, a graduate student, with his supervising professor, Harold Urey. And they imagined what the early atmosphere of the earth was like, and they put the chemicals that they thought were in that atmosphere in some water and heated it, and simulated a lightning strike in the atmosphere to see what kinds of chemicals, compounds they could produce. And they produced a lot of tarry, worthless goo, but they did produce a few amino acids, which are the building blocks of life. A lot of people got really excited and thought they were just on the verge of creating life in the test tube, but they were not even close. Another thing they had in this experiment was, you can see at the bottom there, they had a trap. The reason they had this was because they knew that if they allowed the material that they created in the spark to cycle back through the system, the same system that created those compounds would destroy them. So they had to have a trap. Of course, in the primordial ocean of the earth, there was no such trap. So that's kind of cheating. But Stanley Miller has devoted the rest of his scientific career to studying the origin of life, and he has gotten nowhere near the solution. In fact, Paul Davies, who is at the Australian Centre for Astrobiology, makes this very telling statement on the origin of the first cell. He is a world-renowned scientist, and he says this: "Nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organized themselves into the first living cell." Nobody knows. After 50 years of research, they haven't got a clue. Just today, I read about Harvard University's new origin of life research. They have committed to providing $1 million a year for the next several years to establish an origins of life research center. And the newspaper report about that quoted one of the scientists at Harvard. He said, "My expectation is that we will be able to reduce this to a very simple series of logical events that could have taken place with no divine intervention." The scientists have been working for 50 years, probably thousands of them. They've already spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and they think they're going to find a solution that is a very simple series of logical steps. They have a lot more faith than I do. But as Paul Davies said, they haven't got a clue how lifeless chemicals evolved into the first living cell. So right here at the beginning, the evolution tree of life is dead. If they can't get the first living cell from non-living matter, that's the end of the theory. But it fits the creation view that life was created by God supernaturally. But let's suppose just for a moment that somehow that first living cell came into existence by chance. We'll give the evolutionists the benefit of the doubt. Is the rest of the tree of evolution supported by the evidence? And to begin with, in the first part of this lecture, we're going to look at the fossil record. Does the fossil record support the theory of evolution or the model of creation? Now, the Grand Canyon is one of the best places to see the fossil record. 270 miles long, 4 to 18 miles wide, and a mile deep. And when you look at those layers, you can find, just on the layers as they're exposed in the Colorado River Valley, evidence of billions and billions of fossils buried in those layers. The evolutionists have tried to recreate what that fossil record looked like. They call it the geological time scale or the geological column. And they picture in this time scale that very simple creatures, so-called, came into existence first. They were down here in the bottom of the rock record, and then they diversified into fish and amphibians and reptiles, and eventually into mammals and even into human beings. Now, you need to know that this geological column does not exist anywhere in the real world except in the textbooks and the magazine articles. You cannot drill down into the earth anywhere and find this nice, neat progression of fossils. In fact, we find marine fossils all the way through the geological column. Now, there is a general order, but it's not nearly as nice and tidy as this picture suggests. The evolutionists say that that represents the evolution of life over millions and millions of years. Now, to understand whether the fossil record supports the theory of evolution or not, we need to be very, very clear about the difference between evolution and creation, because the evolutionists are notorious at confusing things. They will often say that evolution is change. Well, evolution is change, but it is a certain kind of change. I'm changing. I don't look exactly the same as I did when I graduated from high school. I have a few less hairs, a few more pounds in different places. But I can guarantee you one thing. I am not evolving. If anything, I'm devolving. I'm going downhill. I'm not going uphill to superhuman. So it's a certain kind of change that evolution has in mind. And I like to call it vertical change. See, the evolutionists believe that the first living cell came into existence by chance, and then it diversified over time by mutations and natural selection into the first fish. And then some of those fish gradually over millions of years evolved into the first amphibians. And then those amphibians evolved into reptiles. And some of the reptiles evolved into birds. Some of the reptiles evolved into mammals. And some of the mammals evolved into people. So it's vertical variation from one kind to a completely different kind of creature. The creation model is very different. The creationists say that there is horizontal variation. God created the first single-celled creatures, different kinds of single-celled creatures. He built into their genetic information the potential for variety within their kind, but not the ability to change into some other kind of creature. He created the first kind of fish, distinct, with the genetic potential for producing variety within that kind of fish, but not to change into a different kind of fish or to change into a non-fish. The same with amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and people. God supernaturally created the first representative kinds with variety, potential for variety. So the question is whether the fossil record and later, as we look at living things, support the idea of vertical change from one kind to another or simply horizontal change within the kinds. Here's a chart from a magazine article in 1978 in Scientific American. The whole issue that month was devoted to evolution. And in the chapter on mammal evolution, we had this chart. It shows the different kinds of mammals there at the top: kangaroo and anteater and rabbit and squirrel and gorilla and whales and tigers and camels and horses, etc. The blue bars coming down are showing us how deep down in the fossil record those creatures appear. And then you'll notice that there are some blue dotted lines that connect some of these blue bars to creatures that they don't know what look like, some creatures that they have an idea, and then they're all connected to a common ancestor, which they don't have a name for or a picture of. Now the question is, does the fossil record support the dotted blue lines? And I call as my expert witness on this question Dr. Stephen Jay Gould. Until his death in 2002, he was probably America's most famous evolutionist. He was an atheist Jew, and he hated creationists, but he was one of the most honest evolutionists. He was a professor of geology and paleontology at Harvard, and he said this about the fossil record. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. I want you to notice two things in that statement. First of all, he tells us that we only have data at the tips and the nodes of the branches. We don't have fossil evidence, he says, for the branches themselves. And then he says, this fact is the trade secret of paleontology. In other words, either all the paleontologists know this and have kept it a secret from the rest of us in society, or only the elite paleontologists like Stephen Gould, who have access to the huge museums, know this, and the low-level junior college paleontologists don't know this. But it's a trade secret, and he says the transitional forms are extremely rare. That is, if evolution is true, you ought to be able to find fossils of 90% reptile, 10% bird, 80% reptile, 20% bird, 70% reptile, 30% bird, 50% reptile, 50% bird, and so on. But he says this is extremely rare. In fact, the evolutionists can only point to a handful of very controversial fossils. So let's draw that diagram from Scientific American the way Stephen Gould says the evidence really is. You'll notice that I erased all the dotted blue lines. That's because Dr. Gould said we don't really have fossil evidence for those dotted blue lines. And then I did one other thing. I changed the bottom ends of those blue bars. I took away the little bend. Why? Because the blue bars don't exist in the fossil record. They only exist on this page of the magazine. It's the fossil creatures that are in the rock record. And as far as they go down, when they find a kangaroo, it looks like a kangaroo. It doesn't look like a part kangaroo. As far as they go down, they see a camel. It's a camel, not a part camel. Now that to me does not look like the evolution tree of life. It looks a lot like the creation forest of life. And Gould goes on in the article that I quoted to say that the two characteristics of the fossil record are abrupt appearance and stasis. That is, that the first time we see a creature appearing in the lowest rock formation that we find it, it appears fully formed, fully functional, fully recognizable. It just abruptly appears. And then as we come up through the rock records, as long as we see that creature, it basically stays the same. Oh, a little bit of variety, but it's basically the same creature. There's lots of evidence of this. They're called living fossils. One example is the Wollemi pine. For many, many years, the evolutionists said that the Wollemi pine was a tree that went extinct 150 million years ago. Until in 1994, west of Sydney, Australia, they found the Wollemi pine growing. And when they compared the Wollemi pine branches and leaves with the fossil, they were virtually identical. Hadn't changed in 150 million years of supposed evolution. The coelacanth was said by the evolutionists to be a fish that died out about 65 million years ago, along with the dinosaurs, because that was the highest level in the rock record that they found the coelacanth. Until 1938, when they found the coelacanth swimming off the coast of Madagascar in deep water. And they've since found it in fishing villages in Indonesia and Japan. And when they compare the living coelacanth with the fossil coelacanth, it's virtually identical. The creature hasn't changed in 65 million years of supposed evolution. There's lots more examples of that. There's what the living creature looks like. Here's an article recently in 2003 about salamanders found fossilized in China. And they said these salamanders have extraordinary morphological similarity to their living relatives. That's a very technical way of saying they look just like the salamanders living today. And they say they've changed little over 160 million years. Army ants have been around 100 million years, the evolutionists say, but they haven't changed. They look just like the living ones. Plesiosaurs have changed little during their 135 million years of evolution. In the lowest rock record where we find a plesiosaur, they look essentially the same as the highest rock record where we find plesiosaurs. They found sea turtles fossilized in rock layers that they said were 100 million years old, but they said they're virtually unchanged compared to sea turtles today. And then here's a really big one. Blue-green algae, the oldest living fossils, dated in rock layers to be 3.5 billion years old, and they are identical to blue-green algae living today. These critters haven't changed at all in 3.5 billion years. Now, I mentioned that the evolutionists do have some fossil evidence that they put forth for evolution. It's rare, but here's one of the evidences. Phil Gingrich, writing in the Journal for Geological Education, a journal for science teachers, he had this picture of this creature that looked like a transitional form between a land animal and a whale. Evolutionists believe that whales evolved from land animals. And you can see that it is on its way to becoming a whale. Its rear end is definitely moving in that direction. It's already on a fish diet. The front legs are still land animal, though. What was the fossil evidence for Phil Gingrich to have his artist draw this? Well, he tells us it was the head. No, it was not the head. It was just the stippled parts of the skull. He had no fossil evidence at this time below the neck. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it difficult to see how you can take that piece of bone and that piece of bone and then tell me what the front legs looked like and what the rear end looked like. But Phil Gingrich said about this creature, which he called Pakicetus, which means whale from Pakistan, which is where the fossil was found. In time and in its morphology, Pakicetus is perfectly intermediate, a missing link between earlier land mammals and later full-fledged whales. Well, now that article was written in 1994, but they found some more fossils after 1994. And in a technical article in the British journal Nature, which is the world's leading English language technical science journal, there was an article in 2001 about Pakicetus and all the fossil evidence they had found since 1994. And this was the evidence. Looks a lot like a whale to me, doesn't it? And by our study of anatomy, the scientists can guess pretty well what this creature looked like when it was alive. And they said these were terrestrial mammals, that is land-based mammals, no more amphibious than a tapir. Kind of like a pig. I don't know if you've been down to the ocean side recently, but I haven't seen any pigs swimming in the ocean recently. So this is a case of misinterpreted fossil evidence, jumping to conclusions on the basis of very skimpy evidence. And the evolutionists in the last 100 years have done this over and over again. But that's not the end of the story. A couple of months ago, I was hunting around on the website, and I went to the University of Berkeley, California website. They have a whole website devoted to evolution and all the evidence for evolution. And they have evidence from living things, and they have fossil evidence. And I clicked on the icon for fossil evidence, and they had two pieces of evidence for horse evolution and whale evolution. And I was developing this talk at that time, and I thought, well, this ought to be interesting. I think I'll see what they have to say about whale evolution. So I clicked on the icon and came to this page. And it had a picture on the left of this creature with its nostril near the tip of its nose, Pakicetus, dated 50 million years ago. And then this creature over here, beluga whale, with the nostrils up here at the top of the skull. Well, obviously, if that Pakicetus evolved into a whale, then you've got to move that hole for the nose. But listen, there's more to making a sea creature out of a land animal than just moving the hole. I'll give you a simple scientific experiment. You can go home tonight, put clay up your nostrils here, and then get your electric drill and put 2 holes up there. See if you breathe just as well. No, don't do that. I don't want any lawsuits. So it's not just a matter of moving the holes. But then it says transitional form. So I clicked on that icon, and up popped this picture. And lo and behold, the nostrils are in the middle of the skull, and the skull is dated at 25 million years. I mean, that's perfect. That is a transitional form. You creationists, what more do you want? This is a proof of evolution. Well, I said, okay, I know what Pakicetus is, but beluga whales, I'm not an expert on whales, so I had to go on the web and hunt around a little bit. That's what a beluga whale looks like. But now, Ithiocetus, I wonder what that is. They didn't have any information right there at that place on the Berkeley website, so I hunted around a little bit, found out that Ithiocetus was called somewhere else on the Berkeley website and also on another website about whales, that it was the earliest baleen whale. Well, what's a baleen whale? Well, I got a picture of a baleen whale. Now, a baleen whale does not have teeth. They have baleen. It's a sieve system. They open their mouth, take in a big gulp of water and all kinds of food, and then they let the water run out through the sieve and keep the food in their mouth. That's a completely different system from this Ithiocetus. But there's another thing about baleen whales. They are anywhere from 2 to 40 times bigger than a beluga whale. This is not a transitional form between that and that. This is a 100% fully operational whale like that one is, and this is not suited for living in the water. Now, I can only come to one of two conclusions. Either the University of California, Berkeley scientists who put this website together are grossly ignorant about Pakicetus, beluga whales, and baleen whales, or they are deliberately deceiving the public. And I find it hard to believe that they could be that ignorant. I think this is a classic case of deception, of deliberately deceiving the public. The vast majority of people who will visit that website will never do the exploration that I did to check what was going on. So, does the fossil record support evolution or creation? Well, it doesn't support evolution, but it does consistently fit with creation. The fossil record does not support the evolution of tree of life, but it fits exactly with what we would expect from the creation force of life. God made distinct kinds of creatures. We wouldn't expect to see them changing into different kinds of creatures in the fossil record, and in fact, we do not. Well, what about the study of living creatures? We're going to look at that in the second part of this lecture, but I want to introduce it by just looking at one of the very famous proofs of evolution. How many of you have seen this diagram? It appears in a lot of the scientific textbooks. It is from Ernst Haeckel's book in 1877. He was the leading German evolutionist at that time, and he presented a theory called embryonic recapitulation, that the embryo rehearses its evolutionary history as it develops, and that all mammals have the same kind of embryonic development. And he gave as proof of this these pictures. You have the pig, the cow, the rabbit, and the human. And just look at the same stage of development, they're virtually identical. So this is just proof positive that the theory of evolution is true. The only problem is these pictures were a fraud. They were known to be a fraud by German medical doctors at the time, but they went into the evolution textbooks. Let me show you that they're a fraud. Here are Haeckel's drawings of a fish, salamander, turtle, chicken, rabbit, human. Now I'm going to show you the actual photographs of these creatures, and I'll admit that they look pretty close to Haeckel's drawings, but if you look carefully, you can see a difference. Here they are. Don't they look just like Haeckel's drawings? Here's some more creatures. They don't look anything like Haeckel's drawings. He was deliberately deceiving his readers. But that's not the end of the story. Those pictures still appear in our textbooks today. Here is a high school biology textbook. We have this in our Answers in Genesis library, used here in the United States, and there are Haeckel's drawings right up at the top. I've looked at the book, read everything around the picture. There's not a hint that those pictures are fraudulent. Here's a book by Ernst Mayr. He was the greatest evolutionist after Stephen Jay Gould. He died at the age of 100 just a year ago. And in his book, What Evolution Is, which was written for the general public, in the chapter, What is the Evidence for Evolution, here we have Haeckel's drawings. I have the book in my library, and there's nothing in the discussion around this picture that would let Mayr's readers know that these are fraudulent pictures. So, conclusions for this first part of our discussion of Darwin's theory. First, the evolutionists have no idea how the first living creature came into existence by chance. Secondly, they have no indisputable fossil evidence that one kind of creature evolved into a different kind of creature. They just have a handful of highly debatable examples, and sometimes fraudulent examples. In the second part of our lecture, we're going to look at living creatures to see whether they support the theory of evolution or creation. Stay tuned. Okay, in our last session, we began to discuss the question of the origin of species. Was Darwin right? And we came to two conclusions from looking at the question of the origin of life itself from non-living matter, and then the fossil evidence. And we saw that the evolutionists have no idea how the first living cell came into existence by chance. And secondly, we spent more time discussing the fossil record and showed that the evolutionists have no indisputable fossil evidence that one kind of creature changed into a different kind of creature. So in this last part of this lecture, we want to look at the question, does the study of living creatures support evolution or the creation model of the forest of life? And again, I want to draw your attention to two key questions. One is, how did the DNA information for the first supposed living microscopic creature come into existence? And secondly, how did that DNA information in that simple creature get changed and augmented to produce all the different kinds of plants and animals that we see in the fossil record and living world today? Now, I'm quite confident in saying that there is not an evolutionist on the face of this earth who would walk up to this scene on the beach of Florida and say, "Isn't it amazing what the ocean washed up on the shore last night?" They would never say that. They would know instantly, instinctively, this was the product of intelligence. A clever person put those sand grains together. You see, information is conveyed through that sandcastle, and information comes from a mind. Werner Giet is a German scientist. He is the director and professor at the German Federal Institute of Physics and Technology in Germany, and he is an expert on information theory. And in his book, In the Beginning Was Information, he said this: "There is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter." The information that you see on that screen right now does not come from the light particles or light beams shining on that screen. They don't come from the pixels or whatever else it is that is causing that on my computer screen. It doesn't come from the electronics. It doesn't come from the keys. The information didn't come from my fingers. It came from my mind as I was reading Werner Giet's book. And the book, it was not the ink and the paper that produced the information. It was Werner Giet's mind. Information always comes from mind. It does not come from matter. And we know this without even thinking about it. We see things like the space shuttle or telephone or motorcycles or computers, and we know these did not come into existence except as a result of a great quantity of intellectual activity. In fact, those things were made by engineers who left nothing to chance. They planned everything in the manufacturing process as well as the end result. But those things are simple compared to the simplest living creatures. This is a microscopic insect called the midge. And look at the complexity of its eyes and those hair-like structures and the mouth structure. This is not a simple creature. We might say it's simple compared to human beings, but it is not simple. It is more complex than even a Boeing 747. Now, the question for evolution is, where do you get the information to make such things? And the evolutionists have two mechanisms for their theory of evolution. They are, one, natural selection, and two, random mutations. Let's consider each of these concepts in order. Both of these ideas are based on the DNA information in living things. Now, the DNA molecule is a very, very complex molecule made of chemicals that contain or carry a language. And this language is made up of 4 chemical letters, like the letters of our alphabet. You might compare it to a rope with beads and rods. You could spell the word help if you knew Morse codes with beads and rods. Well, the DNA molecule is carrying the information in the way that that rope is carrying the information. And now, you all know what DNA stands for. It stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. But that's way too hard to remember. There's a much easier way to remember what DNA stands for. It means definitely no accident. Because information does not come into existence by accident. It comes into existence because of a thoughtful mind. Now, if you were to pack enough DNA to fill the head of a pin, the amount of information that little bit of DNA would carry would be equivalent to a stack of books from the earth to the moon 240 times. Or equivalent to a stack of CDs flat 110 kilometers high. Richard Dawkins, the atheist evolutionist in Britain, a leading evolutionist at Oxford University, says that the amount of DNA in every cell of your and my body is equivalent to 3 to 4 sets of the 20 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. That is a lot of information. And that information determines whether you have big bones or small bones, whether you're female or male, whether you have blonde hair or brown hair, blue eyes or green eyes, and all the other features about your life. The DNA information is what determines whether the peas will be yellow or green or in between, whether they'll be wrinkled or smooth or in between. These were the kinds of peas that Gregor Mendel studied in his pea garden outside his little parish home in Czechoslovakia, right at the time that Darwin was publishing his theory. And he didn't know about the DNA, but he knew there was something inside the peas that was controlling the expression of color and texture. The DNA is what produces this variety in horses: big horses, little horses, horses with different color hair, different size feet, etc. It's the DNA that determines the skin color in human beings. These kids are all at one school in Washington, D.C. They all have the same skin color. It's just that some of them have DNA saying make a lot of skin color, and some of them have DNA saying make just a little bit of skin color. Now, let's consider natural selection. First thing we need to know is that natural selection is a fact. All creationists believe in natural selection if they're informed, and they always have. In fact, there was a British geologist by the name of Edward Blythe who wrote about the principle of natural selection in a scientific journal in England 30 years before Darwin published his theory. So creationists believe in natural selection. But natural selection is not evolution. And this is where the evolutionists deceive us. They will equate natural selection and evolution, so they give examples of natural selection and say, see, evolution is a fact. No, evolution and natural selection are not the same thing. Remember, evolution is changing one kind of creature into another. All creatures, plants or animals, are descended from a common ancestor. Secondly, natural selection is a conservative process, not a creative process. Nature can only select what's already there. It can't create something new that's not there. It selects what is there. So it's conservative. It's preserving something of what's already there. Now let's illustrate this. Take the genus Canis, the dog kind. This picture is taken from an evolutionary biology textbook, and they show us that all of these different creatures, the coyote, red wolf, jackal, dingo, are all related to the domestic dog. They can interbreed, and some of them can interbreed naturally in the wild. They could probably all interbreed naturally if it was organized by scientists. And so evolutionists believe that all of these different kinds of dogs are actually descended from a common ancestor. And creationists would agree with them, something like a wolf. But the question is, where did the first dog come from? Not how do you get the variety, but where did the first dog come from? So they would say, the evolutionists would say, and creationists would agree, that from something that looked like a wolf, we got coyotes and dingles and collies, and eventually all the domestic dogs, including poodles. But this is not evolution. What we need to realize is that this process of change actually involves a loss of genetic information. The poodle does not have all the genetic information that the wolf had. It's been lost in the process of reproduction. So we didn't create something new with a poodle. All the genetic information for making a poodle was there in the original wolf population. Now let's illustrate this idea further, considering hair length. Suppose you have two dogs coming off the ark in the days of Noah, and they have medium length hair. And they have in their genetic information a gene for making long hair and a gene for making short hair. It's more complicated than this. There are more genes involved, but it's an accurate representation in simple terms of what's going on. Now, if those two dogs mate, what are they going to produce? Well, Mendel's genetics will accurately predict for us that they will produce some puppies that have short hair. They get the short-haired gene from mom and the short-haired gene from dad. Some puppies will be medium-length hair. They will have a long and short-haired gene. And some of the puppies will be long-haired. They'll only get the long-haired gene from mom and dad. Now, if we breed those two long-haired dogs, what will happen? Well, they will produce nothing but long-haired puppies because they have lost the genetic information for producing short-haired offspring. We don't have a creation of a new kind of dog. We have a conservation of existing genetic information that was there with the original parents. So the dogs come off the ark. They're in a pack there, and they're all intermingling, but there's no reason for them to all stay together. So they start having puppies, and they start traveling and migrating, looking for new sources of food. And some of those dogs begin to migrate up into Europe, and it's getting colder every winter. And the farther north they go, the colder it gets. And pretty soon the short-haired dogs can't make it through the winter. They freeze to death. And going far enough north, pretty soon only the long-haired dogs make it through the winter. Nature has selected the long-haired dogs because they have the characteristics that will allow them to live in that environment. But all the information for long hair was in the puppies that came off the ark. Conversely, you have some of the dogs moving into Africa. The farther south they go, the more the dogs with long hair are panting to beat the band. They can't cool their system off. And pretty soon they die of overheating in the summer. But the short-haired dogs are just basking in the sun. They're just enjoying it. This is fantastic. So they survive the summer and have puppies. And pretty soon all you've got is short-haired dogs in Africa. Nature has selected those varieties for a particular environment to preserve some of the created kind. So natural selection can explain the survival of the fittest, but it does not explain the arrival of the fittest, which is the real question. It doesn't explain where the dogs came from in the first place. It just explains how the dogs can survive in different environments. We want to know where the dogs came from in the first place. Darwin's theory of natural selection never explained that. So natural selection, from a creationist perspective, is the God-designed method of preserving representatives of the original created kinds. God knew that the environment would change after the fall of Adam and Eve and after the flood, and so he created those creatures at the beginning with the ability to adapt to changing environments to preserve representatives of those original created kinds. So natural selection doesn't prove goo to you via the zoo. It doesn't prove microbe to microbiologist evolution. It doesn't prove that a single-cell creature evolved into all the different kinds of plants and animals, because natural selection is only a conservative process, not a creative one. Well, what about mutations? Do they supply the new information for evolution? These poor critters have been the object of many evolutionary experiments for many decades. Fruit flies. They take these fruit flies, start with two normal ones up here at the top, and they bombard them with radiation to see what kinds of mutations they can produce. And they produce fruit flies with fringed wings, and fruit flies with little itty-bitty vestigial wings, and fruit flies with no wings at all, or fruit flies with an extra set of wings, but no muscles to run those wings, so those extra wings get in the way of the ones that do work. Or fruit flies with legs, an extra set of legs growing out of their eyeballs. All kinds of variety from these mutations. But none of these fruit flies are an improvement on the fruit fly. And none of them would survive in the wild. Nature would select the healthy, normal ones and weed out these mutants. The only reason they survive is because they're in the laboratory where the scientists protect them for their experiments. So, we need to realize that mutations are a fact. All creationists believe in mutations, even though sometimes evolutionists imply that we don't. But mutations nearly always reduce the genetic information. They never increase functional information. Lee Spetner is a Jewish scientist. As far as I know, he's not even a believing Jewish scientist. But he wrote a book, Not by Chance, Shattering the Modern Theory of Evolution, back in 1998. He's an expert on mutations, and this whole book is about mutations. And in this, he says, all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information and not to increase it. He even gives an example. He says, with this picture, no mutations have ever been observed that have converted an animal to a markedly different species, say from a fly to a wasp. I mean, that's not a very big change to go from a fly to a wasp. But he says we haven't even observed a mutation to make that kind of a change. You see, an amoeba has certain information in its DNA for making an amoeba, but it has no information for making legs or hair or a nose or a stomach or eyeballs. A horse has genetic information for making all of those parts, but an amoeba does not. So you cannot make a horse by taking the DNA information in an amoeba and just copying it over and over and making mistakes in the copying process as you go. You have to have new information added to the DNA molecule. But then evolutionists say, yes, that's true about mutations. They generally do decrease the information, but there are some beneficial mutations. But we've got to be careful here. We've got to define what we mean by beneficial, and we've got to pay attention to what happens to the information in the process. One example is a bacterium called H. pylori. These are nasty little critters that patients don't like and doctors don't like. And so doctors have figured out that there's an antibiotic that will kill these little critters. And here's how it works. The antibiotic is taken by the patient, it's absorbed into the system, and then the bacterium living in the patient absorbs that antibiotic through the cell wall of the bacterium. Then it produces an enzyme that converts that antibiotic to a poison, and the poison kills the bacterium. It's assisted suicide. Okay? But there's a problem. Sometimes the H. pylori has a mutant. And so the mutant absorbs the antibiotic through the cell wall. But because of a mutation in its genetic information, it does not have the ability to make the enzyme that will convert the antibiotic into poison. So it can't make the enzyme, therefore it doesn't produce the poison, therefore it doesn't die. It survives. Now it is survived, however, by a loss of information. So we compare the two then. A healthy, normal H. pylori takes the antibiotic in, it dies. But the mutant can't produce the enzyme, so it survives, and then it reproduces, and then it gives headaches to the doctors and the patients. And they have to figure out a different antibiotic to try to get rid of the mutant. There was a beneficial mutation for the H. pylori. It did allow it to survive, but it survived because of a loss of information. It was not on its way to becoming something other and better than an H. pylori. It's a defective H. pylori. I live in Cincinnati, and suppose I wanted to go on a train to Chicago. And so I take my trusty train schedule with me, and I go down to the Cincinnati train station. And I don't pay attention to any of the signs. I've got my trusty train schedule with me. And my train schedule says that the train to Chicago is on platform 14. So I walk to platform 14, get on the train. Unfortunately, there was a mutation in my train schedule. The train on platform 14 is not going to Chicago. It's going to Atlanta. The train that's going to Chicago is on platform 24. I'm on the wrong platform. It does not matter how slowly that train on platform 14 goes. It can move a centimeter a century, and it will never get me to Chicago because it is going in the wrong direction. It's going downhill, and I need to be going uphill. Well, the train of natural selection and mutation is the train that the evolutionists say will take us from a single-celled creature all the way to all the diverse and complex plants and animals we see in the world, which would involve increased information. The problem is that the train of natural selection and mutation is going in the wrong direction. It's not going in the direction of increased information, it's going in the direction of decreased information. And Lee Spetner makes a humorous analogy in his book, Not by Chance. He says, whoever thinks macroevolution can be made by mutations that lose information is like the merchant who lost a little money on every sale but thought he could make it up on volume. You know, I'm in the broom business. I buy my brooms for $1 and I sell them for 80 cents. And I come home after the first day and I say, honey, I took a beating. I lost a lot of money. But don't worry, we're going to get that vacation to Hawaii. I'm going to double my sales tomorrow. No, you're not going to get to Hawaii that way. Losing information is not the way to gain information. Losing money is not the way to make money. And so, how do we fit the mutations into the creationist view? Well, the Bible says that we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. The Bible says that we live in a corrupted, fallen, cursed world. It's not the original perfect creation that God made. And so mutations are the God-ordained consequences of His curse on creation because of Adam's sin. And so we can very soundly assume that before Adam and Eve sinned, there were no mutations because there was no disease, there was no death. But then Adam sinned, and that brought the judgment of God on the creation. It brought death, and we know from our study of mutations that the mutations are increasing in the human genome. We're getting more and more genetic problems. But the Bible says there will become a day when there will be no more death, no more crying, no more pain, no more suffering. Those mutations will be gone. So right now, we live in a cursed world where there are mutations. So let's conclude then. We can say on the basis of studying both the fossils and living things that undirected, random natural processes like mutation and natural selection, time and chance and physical processes, plus time does not equal complex functional design. It takes intelligence to produce complex design. And you know what? The evolutionists know this, and they even reason this way when it suits their purposes. There is not an evolutionist on this planet who would walk into a cave, say in South Africa, and see these objects laying on the floor, a piece of wood with some animal skin wrapped around one end of a stone, and then a string with a whole bunch of hornets' bodies strung together, and a piece of bone that looks like a horse head, and a piece of stone that looks like it could be a spear point. There's not an evolutionist who would see that and say, isn't it amazing what happened as a result of the wind blowing in this cave and some animals rummaging around? It just produced these things. No, they say, this is proof positive there were human beings in this cave. They also do it when they're looking into outer space. The SETI program uses this radio telescope in Puerto Rico twice a year to listen to sounds coming from outer space. What are they listening for? They're listening for some kind of organized pattern of sounds, irregular patterns that are organized, that have some repetition and complexity to them, that are different from random noise. And they have now recruited thousands of people all over the world to use their PCCs to link into the SETI computers to analyze this stuff. And they've been doing this for years. What will they think if they hear a sound of organized pattern of sounds? They will say, there it is, proof positive, we're not alone in the universe. There are alien beings out there. Even though they can't see them, even though they don't know what the message means, they will know that that is evidence of intelligence. See, they use the same principle to prove their theory. But it doesn't. It refutes their theory. So the evolution tree of life, just as Michael Denton said, as I quoted in the first part of the lecture, he says there's no really hard scientific evidence to support the theory of evolution. But the creation forest of life fits the facts. Natural selection is a fact. Mutations are a fact. But natural selection plus mutation equals molecule-to-man evolution? That is not a fact. And why isn't it? Because concerning the chance origin of the simplest life form, the evolutionists can't explain where the information came from. Didn't come from matter, came from a mind. But they rule out a mind. They say there was no mind. Bacteria to biologist evolution, goo to you evolution, there are no indisputable transitional fossils. And natural selection and mutation in living things does not produce the new information necessary to change one kind of creature into another. To change a creature that doesn't have feathers and hollow bones into a creature that does have feathers and hollow bones. To change a creature that doesn't have hair into a creature that does have hair. To change a creature that gives birth to offspring inside an egg to creatures that give birth to offspring live. They don't have the way to make the new genetic information. Now, one other thing before we finish here. Evolution, the issue here between evolution and creation is not an issue between microevolution and macroevolution. A lot of creationists used to say that. But we need to get that kind of language out of our mind, because the issue is not the size of change, the issue is the direction of change. It's not that if you just take a lot of little micro changes and add millions of years, you'll get macro changes. The problem is all of the changes that the evolutionists have are going in the downhill direction, and we need something to go in the uphill direction. So the issue is the origin and addition of genetic information. That's what we have to communicate to people who've been evolutionized, because all they will ever hear is change, change, change. It's a certain kind of change. It's an increase of information. Well, so what? Is this just something that's interesting to people who really like science? No, it has very practical ramifications. Charles Darwin said this: a man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or of a future existence with retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest and which seem to him the best ones. In other words, you just define your morality according to your own personal opinion. And that kind of philosophy has disastrous consequences, and sometimes they're pretty sad. Here's one evidence of that. You remember the Columbine massacre in 1999? Those two boys, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who killed 13 students and teachers and injured 25 others. 1 year before they committed that massacre, Eric wrote in his diary, "Sometime in April, me and V will get revenge and will kick natural selection up a few notches." In fact, one of those boys was wearing a t-shirt on the day of the murders that said natural selection. Now, we're not blaming evolution for their behavior, but evolution was clearly an influence in their behavior. And they were thinking, well, it's the survival of the fittest. And they carried out an atrocity. You see, if an ape is in our ancestor, if Darwin's theory is right, then that means there are no moral absolutes. Man just makes his own rules. And what's good for you is good for you. What's good for me is good for me. Which is a nice philosophy. Unless you're all Jewish and my name is Adolf Hitler. Or you're all black and I'm a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Then that's not a nice philosophy. Our culture is being bombarded with this theory of evolution all the time in the popular press. And much of the church doesn't even notice or care. You remember in my first lecture, I talked about Pakicetus, and I talked about the scientist who found Pakicetus and described it as a transitional form between land animals and whales. His name was Phil Gingrich. In that National Geographic article that I showed you the cover of it in the first lecture, they talked about the spiritual implications of evolution, and they interviewed Phil Gingrich. And in that article, they quoted him as saying this: "I grew up in a conservative church in the Midwest and was not taught anything about evolution. The subject was clearly skirted. I submit to you that Phil Gingrich is an evolutionist and probably an atheist today, influencing other students because his church failed to teach him how to think about the theory of evolution. He was unprepared for the onslaught he would encounter in college." So, was Darwin wrong? Well, he was right about natural selection, but he didn't say anything really new. He just gave a lot of examples to support an idea that had already been talked about by a creationist named Edward Blythe 30 years earlier. But he was dead wrong about the fact that natural selection does not lead to goo to you, microbe to microbiologist evolution. I want to close with a verse from the book of Romans. Paul says this: "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." Paul says that the fingerprints of God are all over His creation. And if we don't see it, it's because we are deliberately suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. And so, may God help us to see the evidence that He has given that confirms His word right in Genesis. God bless you.